I'm on the Vacation Bible School program at Crossroads starting tonight down on Highway 5, and I'm going to use some of the material that I've been asked to deal with at Crossroads tonight. Just kind of walk through some of this material, and certainly it's questions that are still pretty pressing in our day and time. And they asked me to deal with some of the matters that my theme is. You are God's masterpiece. But the underlying theme that I've been asked to address is some of the social and gender issues that have plagued the country for a number of years now, particularly the last 10 to 20 years. And so what I want to do as just by way of introduction is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to admit defeat. And the reason I say that is that for the word gender is found in the English language going back to the 1400s or the 14th century to the 1300s. So that'd be the 14th century. And the word gender finds its origin in the word gene, G-E-N-E, which we understand is a form of what we find in our New Testament, the word genes, meaning to beget or to be born. It's also the base word for genetics and other associated words. And gender finds its way into the English language in the 1300s as a word which is used interchangeably for what has been called for centuries and centuries and centuries the concept of sex. Now, the reason I'm admitting defeat is that sex has always been used in the English language for years and years and years to describe male or female. You know, I saw my birth certificate not long ago. You know, and it did not say gender. You know, it said sex on it. You know, male, and the word sex has always, up until just recent years, has always meant your biological sex, either male or female. Gender has been around since the 1300s, and the word gender has always been related to male and female. But in its original composition and usage, the word gender was used in regard to language and not to people. In other words, people had a sex and words had a gender which would correspond to male or female or neuter. And for example, when we're reading in our New Testaments, all right, in the original language, you know, words that are in the New Testament are written gender specific. There'll be a word, for example, we can determine whether or not a name in the Bible is male or female based on the ending of it. And in that sense, the Greek language, or I should say the Spanish language, is very similar to the Greek language, or Latin is similar to Greek in these senses, in that it's built into the word if it's male or female or neuter or neutral, having neither a male or female emphasis. And so gender has always been used to describe words and not people. And I have fought personally. I have fought let's just put it this way: I'm like an old woman with a broom trying to sweep back the tide. Now I'm standing on the beach with a whisk broom trying to sweep back the tide. I admit defeat. But doing a little more study, I'm not extremely sad about admitting defeat. I just have to come to the realization that our language changes. and words change meanings, and how words are used matters. Okay, and so I've always fought against the idea of calling a person according to gender as opposed to according to sex. But two things started happening. The word gender made its way more into common everyday language and less into literary and scientific language. And then the word sex changed its meaning in the way people use the term sex. And so as the use of the word sex has changed over the last 50 years, and it doesn't mean to most people what it has meant for years and years and years, we just have to accept that the language has changed. And so we want to speak in ways that people can understand. And so it has been up until about the last 25 years that gender and sex are interchangeable. When it first came on, it was sex for people, gender for words. Then the two began to be interchangeable with regard to human beings in about the 1950s. That's where the first introduction of gender was starting to be applied to people and not just to words. Okay? And so now the words are used interchangeably. And I don't have a problem with that. The problem that we have now is that now the leftists among us have tried to separate gender and sex. Whereas the two have been interchangeable for 750 years, now they're separating sex from gender, saying that sex is your biology and gender is how you identify yourself. And therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Facebook has 72 genders listed as possibilities for people who sign up to an account. 72 genders. The current Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate in Texas says there are 6 genders. Now, what does the Bible have to say about this? Well, the Bible tells us that there are 2. There are 2. Now, let me just add this as a quick aside. Sometimes you will hear, if you watch social media, if you watch YouTube, whatnot, watch videos along this, and when somebody will say, "Listen, there's only 2 genders. There's only 2 sexes." Okay. Somebody will invariably, and it'll be somebody from the left, will invariably say, "No, there's a third. There's intersex is a gender." And that is incorrect. The idea of intersex is it is a genetic malformation. It is a genetic anomaly. It is not a separate gender of people. In other words, it is a, for lack of a better term, it is a medical condition. A biological medical condition. It is not a separate third sex or gender. But invariably, when you hear anybody say there are only 2 sexes or there are only 2 genders, somebody is going to try to throw in, well, there's a third, which is intersex. And that's just a complete misuse of the term. It is a misuse of biological terminology. It's a denial of biological reality. It is not a gender. It is, and I look, I don't say this to be mean, but I'm just simply saying it is a biological anomaly. It is a genetic anomaly. Okay, and so I admit defeat on the sex and gender front. I'm willing to accept that we can use them both now interchangeably. But just about the time that I admit that we can use them both interchangeably, now they're trying to make them separate. That gender and sex are not the same. And so that's a problem, where we look, the problems that are created by this idea that gender and sex are 2 different things are many and insurmountable. if there's not two genders, then there are none. If there's not two, then there aren't. In other words, if there's 72, there aren't any. If there's 6, there aren't any. Because if there's 72, there can be 73. Somebody just hasn't made that one up yet. And if there's 73, there can be 1,000. And so if there's not two, there's none. It's kind of like, when everybody's a racist, nobody's a racist. And if there's an infinite number of what are called gender expressions, then there is no such thing as gender. And so we have to fight this idea now that sex is one thing, biological sex, male, female is one thing, and gender is another altogether. Now I want to just run some quick numbers by you just to show you how ridiculous this current movement is. And by the way, the news on this front is getting better. The number of people that are identifying among the alphabet mafia is in decline. And I call them the alphabet mafia because they've hijacked about half of the alphabet to identify themselves. It used to just be the L's and the G's. And then it was the L's and the G's and what is it? LGBs. Then it was the LGBs. And then it was the LGBTs. And then it was the LGBTQs. And then it was the LGBTQIAA+. And that's what it, and then I heard Gavin Newsom's wife say it's the LGBTQIA++. They've run out of letters, and apparently they've run out of arithmetic symbols because they've used the plus twice. And that's why I refer to them as the alphabet mafia. Now, I want you to understand some things. Among who here is a baby boomer? Who here is a baby boomer? If you're a baby boomer, if you were born between 1946 and 1964, you're a baby boomer. All right, the number of people identifying in that category among the baby boomers is less than 2%. Less than 2%. Which means among baby boomers, even all the people who would, if they were homosexuals and didn't want any part of the rest of the alphabet group, which, by the way, many homosexuals do not identify themselves with that group. Less than 2%. Right? Then you have Gen X. Gen X is everybody born from 1965 to 1980. So I'm a Gen Xer. Rhonda she's one of the OGs of the Gen. She's born in 65. She's one of the OGs of the Gen Xers. Among the Gen Xers, the number of people identifying in that long list of letters and arithmetic symbols is less than 5%. Less than 5%. Now, those of us that were in those two generations are probably all familiar with the Kinsey report. Alfred Kinsey put out a report in the early to mid part of the 20th century that claimed that 10% of all people are homosexuals. You can look it up. And the whole time we were growing up, we were told 10% of all people are homosexuals. Again, we're not talking about the B's and the T's and the Q's and the A's and the A's and the pluses and the pluses. We're just talking about the first two letters in that group. We were told 10% of all people fall into that category. Now, what they didn't tell you is that Kinsey did his research and he got his numbers by interviewing men that are in prison. And so, obviously, the Kinsey report is flawed. But we were told 10% of all people, just like, and Rhonda will remember this, John will remember this, everybody that's about my age will remember this, just like we were told another ice age was coming in the 1970s. And then the ice age turned into global warming in the 1980s. And then it went to climate change. And now they don't know what they're going to do with it. But my point is, we have been told things as fact that are patently false. So now we move in from the Gen Xers to the millennials. And millennials are those born from about 1981 to 1995. And the number of millennials that identify with that group is almost 15%. Almost 15%. And then from the millennials, you have the Gen Z. And of the Gen Z, the number of people that identify with that group among Gen Zers, which is everybody, let me back up, adult Gen Zers. But I suspect the number would be higher if you included all Gen Zers, because Gen Z is everybody born from 1996 to about 2016. But of adult Gen Zers, the number is between 23 and 30%. Identify somewhere in that scale. Now, people will try to tell us it's always been 25 to 30%. It's just now that society is allowing for people to express themselves in this way. They've always been here, but they've always been in the closet. And I'm calling hogwash on that. I'm calling hogwash on that. Because look, the numbers really don't. The numbers don't lie. What would be the possible explanation for the generation between 1946 and 1980 to be less than 5% at most, and now all of a sudden we're at 23 to 30%? And I think I have an answer for that. And that is, young people will identify with what is popularized and glorified in the public arena. I'll give you an example. And this is a bad example, although it's actually kind of a good example. When I was 9 years old, Bruce Jenner won a decathlon. 1976 Olympics, Montreal, Canada. The decathlon winner is usually declared as the world's greatest athlete. And Bruce Jenner was the decathlon winner, and he was on Wheaties boxes, and all young men were encouraged to be like Bruce Jenner. Now, not so much. But we can go back before. How many boys in the 1940s and 50s wanted to be Joe DiMaggio? How many boys, and I'm just speaking because I am one, okay? How many boys in the 1960s wanted to be Mickey Mantle? How many boys in the 1970s wanted to be Neil Armstrong? How many of us drank that nasty drink called Tang? Because who drinks Tang, Johnny? Astronauts drink Tang, man. And being an astronaut is the coolest thing ever, right? You get in a spaceship and you leave this earth and you go to the moon and you walk on the moon. And
I don't know if that's not even true.
Yeah, well, most of us still understand that we've been to the moon. So, who wanted to be an astronaut? How about boys in the 40s and 50s? How many of them wanted to be John Wayne? You see, because those types of individuals were held up as this is what you should aspire to be. And now, you've got the Dylan Mulvaney's of the world, and every kind of ilk just like that. You have so-called Hollywood celebrities who are either participating in it or essentially forcing their children to participate in it so that they can satisfy their narcissistic tendencies. And so now that's being held up. But now that many Americans are starting to come to their senses on this, the numbers are in decline. They're in decline. Look, they're not going back into the closet. They're not going back into the closet. They're understanding that most people think, hey, this ain't cool. And the more that we stand up and the more that our society stands up against this nonsense, anti-biology nonsense, the more that people refuse to accept it, this thing is going to continue to go into decline. By the way, almost all of Europe has banned surgically altering minors. All right? Because they've realized how much damage it does to young people to give them puberty blockers and to perform operations on them. They've already figured it out. This is a horrible idea. America is just now starting to catch on. But the more we return back to sanity, the more you're going to see those numbers return. Now look, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. But I don't see that they're ever going to go back to boomer Gen X levels. I think Pandora's box has been opened on this to such a degree that there are just too many people. There are just too many people that will accept it and defend it. That I don't think we're ever going to go back to normality in the sense that it existed, well, for all of humanity up until about the 1970s or the 1980s, and so that's kind of a precursor to what I want to talk about. At least it gives you the impetus behind what I want to talk about, and that is the idea that we are, as human beings, we are God's masterpiece. I really think that a lot of these young people that are being deceived by this are simply trying to find a place to fit in. They want to be accepted. They want to be glorified. It's like if I come out and say this about myself, then I can be assured. And by the way, social media is a huge driver of this. The acceptance that you can't find in Hamilton, Alabama, will be found on Facebook and Twitter or X, TikTok, whatever. You can find thousands of people that will support you when nobody in Hamilton will support you, because we have a lot more sense than most people in the social media world. But we need to help people understand. We need to help people understand where they are in God's plan. And so with that in mind, I just want to think about five things, just quickly, that we can use to help teach people how to avoid or get out of these things. And the first is this: we need to help every human being understand that they are the crown of God's creation. Every human being is the crown of God's creation. When I say the crown, I mean the crown jewel, the finishing touches, the apex of everything that God ever made is summed up in humanity. Every single human being. Because of every human being, it might be said, and should be said, made in the image of God. After God made everything and made everything on the first 5 days, and then made all the beasts, in the first half of day 6, He said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. The Bible says that God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. In the 8th Psalm, and beginning in verse number 3, listen to what David has to say. He said, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? You have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the work of your hands. You've put all things under his feet, all the sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the seas that pass through the paths of the seas. Humanity is the apex crowning achievement of God's creation. After day 1 through day 5, what did God say? Or what does the Bible say that God said about what he had done? It was good. But what did he say? What did he say after he made man? It is very good. It is very good. You know, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1 says, after God made man and made woman, he was finished. He was finished. In other words, he made everything that he intended to make. And he saved man for last and made him in his image. Only human beings are made in the image of God. Our worth is not determined by our wealth. It is not determined by our appearance. It is not determined by our social status. It is not determined by our education. Our worth is seen in the fact that every single one of us is made in the image of God. You're the crown. Do you know who you are? You're the crown of God's creation. Number 2, you are wonderfully designed. You are wonderfully designed. In Psalm 139 and beginning in verse number 13, the psalmist says, you formed my inward parts and covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and my soul knows that very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. In Job chapter 10, and in verse number 8, you get there and read verses 8 through 10 very quickly. Job said, your hands have made me and fashioned me an intricate unity. Verse 9, I pray that you have made me like clay. We were made, now look, we understand that we're not like literally made by the hand of God. But God put into motion the way that we are made. And has in some indescribable way enabled us with an eternal soul. You know, animals don't have souls. Human beings are the only ones who have souls. And God designed us that way. You think about the magnificence of the design of the human body. And by the way, we wouldn't even have to limit this to humans. We can just look at nature in general. You know, consider the eye of a housefly, you know, with 1,000 lenses. You know, when we just look at how we've been made by God, designed by God, we can understand that we are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made. Human beings are a divine testimony are a testimony to divine craftsmanship. You know, when you see a watch, you know that somebody made it. Even if you've never seen a watch before, not only do you know that somebody made it, you know that it serves a purpose. You know, why is it that what we can see in a watch, we can't see in a human being? That God designed us, and He designed us and made us for a purpose. A masterpiece, a painting, implies a masterful artist. And creation points to a creator. And so as we think about ourselves as being the crown of God's creation, we know that we are wonderfully, wonderfully designed. Number 3, and I've already mentioned this, you have been given a soul. You have been given charge over a thing that will live forever. And what you do, what I do, what we do in our bodies determines where our souls will spend eternity. Genesis 2:7, man became a living soul. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7, speaking of the death of the physical man, says, the dust returns to whence it has come, and the soul returns to God who gave it. You know, as God told Adam, you came from dust and you'll go back to dust. And the dust returns to the dust from whence it came, and the soul returns to God who gave it. How valuable is your soul? Jesus said, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? What good is it for a man if he could gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Animals possess life, but humanity possesses a soul. And the greatest thing that you possess, you can't even see. You can't even see it. God has given you an eternal and immortal soul. Number 4, you are the object of God's greatest expression of love. Have you ever thought about that? You are the object of the greatest expression of love that God has ever given. In the fact that He loved us so much that He gave His Son to die for our sins. Romans 5 and verse 6. For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. It says, for a good man someone might dare to die, or for a righteous man someone might dare to die, perhaps for a good man someone might die, but God demonstrates His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Beloved, what manner of love has the Father bestowed upon us that we should be called the children of God? We are the object of the greatest giver and the greatest gift. The value of a thing may be measured by the price that was paid for it. You know, the value of a diamond by the price that was paid. The value of a car. I saw a guy in Memphis, Tennessee yesterday who had 1,000 cars in his collection. It says his car collection might be worth $100 million. You think about the price that was paid for them old GTOs, them road runners. You know, the value of those things is determined by the price it's paid. And the value of humanity is seen in the price that was paid to redeem them from sin and save them from hell. The gift of Jesus and the blood of Christ. Never measure your value by your failures, but rather by the cross. And lastly, this: you are destined for glory. God intends for you glory. It's not that every person will receive glory, but it's God's intention for everyone to receive glory. You know, God sent Jesus to save everybody, and everybody can be saved. But think about the fact that, like Paul said, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me, and the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. We think about the love and the gift of God as being given to all men, but also it was given to us as individuals. Paul personalized the gift, the love of God, and the gift of Jesus Christ. God's purpose for us extends beyond the walks of this life. And so, if we would sum this up for those that might be confused, an artist often sees the finished work long before others do. And God sees what His redeemed people will become. I'll give you an example of this. My Uncle Mike passed away in the end of 2020. But his house is filled with carvings. And his front yard has the equivalent of a totem pole in it that he carved himself. Eagles and Indian faces and all types of, he's got dozens and dozens of carvings. And many of those carvings are simply modifications of the shape of the wood that was already present. You show that to me and you know what I see? Something to burn in my fire pit. But what does he see? He sees what can be removed and make it into an image that all can appreciate. And so it is with all of us. God sees the things that can be removed to create His masterpiece in each one of us. We should live with eternal perspective and allow God to shape His masterpiece in us for all of eternity. God created us, and Christ died for us. And the greatest tragedy is not failing to recognize our worth. It's failing to recognize the God whose image we bear. And so that's what I got for you tonight. Is there anybody here tonight that has not had an earlier opportunity to partake of the Lord's Supper? Anyone need to be served tonight?